All right, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are, and welcome to today's SAAL structured conversation. This session is being recorded and closed captioning is available in the bottom right. You're able to turn that on. I'm Tori Ware. I'm the moderator for today's session. I'm the Senior Strategy and Program Review Consultant in the Center for the Study of Student Life at Ohio State. On behalf of SAAL's Professional Learning and Development Committee, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into our session today, I'd like to briefly plug that SAAL and our committee are continuing to look for additional programs to host in future SAAL structured conversations to meet your professional development needs. We have a proposal that's available on our webpage. We'll post the link in the chat in just a moment. Please feel free to submit your own structured conversation. During this presentation, we invite you to participate by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through the chat function. We will be monitoring that throughout. To get us started, please put your name and role in the chat so our presenters can get a sense of who's in the audience today. So I am now going to turn things over to our presenters. So welcome to Divya, Constance, and Dan. They will introduce themselves and share their thoughts on assessment principles for best practice. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them.
I'll go first since I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. Dan, if you wanted to start the slide deck, sorry. I'm Divya Bheda. I'm the Director for Educational Assessment at Santa Clara University. I also wanted to take this opportunity to make a small plug. If you have loved ones in your life who are close to 40, between 35 and 40 women, please encourage them to get a mammogram done. Because I know we passed Breast Cancer Month, but I'm dealing with it right now, and just loved ones, get a mammogram. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Divya. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Dan Kaczmarek. I am the Director of Student Life Assessment and Research at the University at Buffalo. I'm going to have the co-presenters speak here in a second and introduce themselves, but today we are talking about accelerate the assessment principles for best practice. There's a QR code on your screen for a link to accelerate. I am going to drop that in the chat right now if you haven't had a chance to take a look. We're going to go over accelerate during our presentation today and really hopefully engage in a good conversation about the principles. I'm going to ask Constance, our fearless leader, to introduce herself.
Thank you, team. Ditto to get a mammogram. And my name is Constance Tucker, and I serve in my day job as Vice Provost for Educational Improvement and Innovation at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. And this work that we're talking about today started in partnership with SAAL when I was the president of AAHE, and so I look forward to talking to you about the work. I'll turn it back over to Dan.
Divya, can you introduce yourself and your role as well?
Sorry about that. Yes, so I'm Divya Bheda, Director of Educational Assessment at Santa Clara University. It's a Jesuit university in California. So glad to be here.
Excellent. And a big thank you to both AALHE and SAAL for getting us together today and also being partners on this project as a whole. For AALHE to bringing SAAL into the fold inside of the conversation. That's how I got involved as a member of the board of the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. Folks on the screen might be joining us today from either one of those organizations. I would encourage you to take a look at the resources available both at aalhe.org and studentaffairs.assessment.org. And a big thanks to my colleagues who run the Structured Conversation series for SAAL for organizing everything today and getting us together. So our agenda for today, like I said, I dropped the position statement inside of the chat a little earlier. We're going to introduce the Accelerate principles, talk about how they were created and the kind of care and detail that kind of went into that process. Talk a little bit about how they can be used in multiple institutional contexts across multiple levels of assessment, and then really invite you to a moment of kind of co-creation and scholarship where we can kind of talk about how they might be applied to the work that you're doing. Constance, Divya, and myself are but 3 of the 6 authors on this, so we also want to recognize Karen, Jeremy, and Terry for their work on this project. And if you look at the position paper, there were a bunch of other folks that were involved in the process as well, giving kind of a look at that. So I encourage you to look at all of those details. But let's start at the beginning with the origin story and the 9 principles of good practice for assessing student learning. It is amazing to think that these are 33 years old in their creation, and they still do resonate very strongly in many ways. They really served to kind of pull together what responsible and impactful assessment practice looks like. And I know looking at the 9 principles, they were introduced to me through kind of educational, when I was learning about assessment. And if you think back to our field 33 years ago, things are very different, right? There's so many of us around the table now in so many different kinds of contexts at our universities. And though the principles themselves have been looked at and kind of slightly tweaked here and there over that time, this is the first time we kind of took a real hard look at the principles and like, what is it about the current context that we're in that might require some sort of revision or update. A lot has changed, but a lot has stayed the same. So really that with a lens toward how are we putting data to use, which is kind of core to what we're trying to achieve in our work inside of assessment. I'm going to ask Constance and Divya if you want to talk, if you have anything else to add about the origin story, while I drop in the chat just a question for how have you historically used the 9 principles of good practice for assessing student learning as an assessment practitioner? So if you have time, you could drop those in the chat for me. I'll be on the lookout. All right, never heard of them prior to this revision. That is good to hear. Also, they kind of snuck into my life in a weird way, right? I find them in a book, and then suddenly then I'm pulled into this project, and I'm like, hey, there they are. All right, using them for accreditation practices. Once again, that kind of education experience. Embracing the notion of assessment for learning rather than the assessment of learning. That's a really good point. Use them as an instructional faculty member. And somebody else was also kind of speaking to their alignment with other kinds of frameworks that exist, right? So we do have a lot of these different kinds of frameworks that kind of exist in the work that we're doing and how they're all kind of aligned. You'll hear a little bit later in the revision of this how we're kind of taking that into consideration. You can keep kind of adding those inside of the chat, but I'm going to turn it over to Constance to speak a little bit about the process of the revision.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And your reactions to the principles. I asked this question probably a year ago and had a very similar reaction, which is in a room of 50 people, there were probably 5 who could pull it out of their desks and talk about how they could use the work. And then there was another group that was like, never heard of them. And then there was a group that had heard of them, but didn't quite use them and couldn't tell you much about them. And so my hope is that we'll revive some of the intent of the work and then build on where we think that it has some really relevant implications for the work that we do now and where we hope to go with the work that we've created. So some of you may have heard of Trudy Bonta. She is one of the original authors of the Good Principles. And I was really excited to be in conversation with her. as one of our first steps when we read the principles and said, hey, these are 33 years old. Maybe there's time for a refresh, a revision, rethinking. I would love to hear from an original author. And when I invited Trudy to the conversation, she immediately said yes. And we had a very engaged conversation. And the truth was, even the original authors were excited about rethinking what the principles could look like and how they could be applied. And she was able to bring into context how they came about, which Dan has talked about. And there was a lot of focus on accreditation and kind of making sure there was accountability layers in the way that we did work. But I would say Trudy was one of the first people to mention that the principles needed to move into both an active and action-oriented framework. And so she wanted to see the passive language kind of be minimized and the active language enhanced. She really wanted to see senior leadership's role in assessment activities to be called out. And as you might imagine, a lot of us are assessment professionals who might be like deep in the work, but there is an active role that senior leadership plays in how assessment data is used to inform decision making. And so Trudy was really excited about seeing a layer of accountability and a call out for leadership. The other place that I think, and I'll highlight, from this list, is that Trudy was interested in seeing both the principles rethought, but also how they could apply in the real world for practitioners. And I think that's where all of us can have really robust conversation about how can we take these principles and move into our daily work with these in mind, so that it's not a document that sits on a pin board in our office, but that it's a living kind of activity that we continue to refer to and reimagine. I'll take you to the next slide, because I think the other part of this process is that we didn't just talk to one person. We talked to a lot of people and had a lot of revision over the last year. And so I just want to highlight what that process looked like. And then hopefully as we talk, you'll see elements of those phases of our conversations show up in the way that we came up with the work. So it started out with the original conversations with the original authors, but then it also was a lit review in kind of that first phase around what all do we see in the literature around good principles of assessment. What have other organizations like NALOA and AALHE and AACNU said about good practices of assessment, and how does equity-centered frameworks, for example, fit with this work that we now have emerging literature that didn't exist 33 years ago? How could we take into account some of this work? In phase 2, we focused on doing some needs assessments, and that was both at conferences. So you might have seen Divya or Dan or I at Assessment Institute or an AALHE conference asking for feedback about the principles and really just opening up a discussion around, if you could have guidance, what would that guidance include that exists already or could be included in the revisions. In phase 3, we took a look at drafting up our first versions of the principles and tried to emphasize equity, and we're intentional about trying to integrate both teaching and learning as well as student affairs. As you might imagine, that first version of the principles didn't refer to learning outside of a classroom. And so how could we bring in student affairs? And so we asked a lot of questions through different lenses, trying to figure out how we could incorporate that, and had many discussions about that with that core team that we mentioned in the beginning. And what I would say is an interesting kind of evolution of that work was that we realized that we needed to return to some values and why questions around why we were doing this work. And I think we'll get into that as we're talking. But we needed to say, who is our audience? And what do we want them to do with this? And we'll hope that you walk away having those two things very clear by the end of our discussion. In the final phases, we drafted up that first version and then took it to the public. And so we went through conferences like AAHE and SAAL's, conversations, but also much more broadly to listservs. And we asked folks to provide feedback on all sorts of aspects of both the language, the jargon-free, ideally, language, but also accessibility, keeping that language not at a kind of 20th grade grad school language, but a really accessible entry point for the way in which we talk about assessment, so that, and remember my comment about Trudy, so that senior leaders who may not be assessment experts would still understand what we're trying to do through these principles when they read them without needing to go through an assessment boot camp. And then thinking very carefully about explicit inclusion of equity and advocacy for our learners, remaining student-centered towards the end. And that phase of feedback went through cycles 2 and 3 times over, and we were able to publish that work last month in a what we would call a iterative submission, meaning that we think that this is a rethinking of the document, but probably not the final. And so we look forward to kind of seeing how this is used and evolves and continues to inform practice. So I'll stop there and pass it back over to Dan.
Thank you, Constance. Thanks, Dan. So we, as a group, when we talked about what accelerate meant, right? Because the original principles were good principles for good practice. We said these are value-based commitments that guide the work of any professional, and that was the biggest thing. Originally, when I spoke with Trudy, she said the original principles were also written by faculty for faculty, right? These were folks who were faculty who are coming in and talking about assessment of student learning for faculty to doing accreditation work. And so it was, today assessment spans so much. There's administrative assessment, there is institutional assessment, there are change-making processes, there's communication, data. So there's so many more intersections, and the way we think about assessment is so much broader than what it was then. And so then we said, is it only higher ed? Does it also need to include, what about K-12 transition, right? What about assessment professionals in that space? And so the group, all of us who came together, we were talking about how assessment happens in so many different spheres. Now we have competency-based education, we have skills validation, corporate sectors coming in, we have educational developers, so there's ed tech. So we wanted assessment to speak, like these principles to speak to everyone who's kind of engaging in that change-making work or improvement work across all of these spheres, to support student learning, to support institutional success, organizational effectiveness. So we came up with this position statement, which says, guide the important work of any professional within education and beyond, whose aim is to improve, innovate, and excel in any learning, planning, development, or improvement efficacy context, so in service of learner. So we've made it intentionally broad because we ourselves had multiple rounds of conversations but it can't be only for this and it can't be only for that. And we wanted to make sure we were able to support any professional doing this work. So the who of assessment, and again, assessment as a field over the last few years, and especially in the current political context, is uniquely positioned to be able to inform decision making and to drive change and decision making. And so the who is change makers, so basically professionals who have assessment, evaluation, continuous improvement, strategic planning, so anything in their responsibilities or their titles. And we want to especially honor, there are folks staff members, especially in higher education, who do continuous improvement work, faculty members who do continuous improvement work that's not recognized because you're just trying to change processes and improve processes. So we wanted this to be a resource that they could go back to and say, this is what it looks like to align with doing this well, right? Employers, again, like I said, competency-based education, skills validation, you have more and more of the corporate sector coming in, people development. We wanted assessment. How do we assess? How do we help growth in any organization, however that growth is perceived at the individual level, at the organizational change level, at the organizational learning level as well. And then, of course, educators, right? And so this is most of us in this room today, I probably would assume, and based on all your introductions. but faculty, staff, administrators across all types and all levels of education and ed tech. So that's who these principles are meant for. And then what these principles aim to do, and I've alluded to this already, so I'll give you like a minute to to read what is here. But it's the idea that the original principles, when we asked for feedback, so when we did the road shows, like when we went to Assessment Institute or AAHE, we asked folks like, what are your thoughts on the original principles? If you haven't read them, read them now. Come in preparation for conversation. And folks, basically, a lot of folks said there's a lot of ideas smushed into one. Can we parse them out? So in addition to everything that Constance said, that was one of the main things. So, and then where is the big idea? Like, where is equity included? Where are we addressing the power dynamics? Where are we addressing the communication? Where are we addressing the use, right? And so the idea was to make sure that these principles then are applicable, so that then they have, like, how can we engage who we are working with on our campuses or in any sphere that we find ourselves in any assessment context? How can they then positively impact and intentionally impact the folks who are collaborating with us or who are impacted by assessment? So the focus was and has been with these principles to make it more inclusive, so that more folks are involved in decision making and in the design. Because if you don't have people involved in the design, it'll impact decision making. That we have more folks involved in the whole process, from design all the way through communication of findings, right? And then making recommendations for improvement. That it acknowledges the layer of power and positionality, and who has access to what information, and then who has access to information about how your assessment findings are being used in decision making, right? So the power dynamics, like the subtext of or the implicit curriculum, in assessment. And then how do we ensure fairness and accessibility for everyone in the work that we're doing? A lot of times assessment is perceived as only people with data analysis, like heavy quant data analysis skills, can do this or can take this on. So how do we offer assessment as a tool that there are different kinds of data? There's not only one kind of data, and all of the data can be looked at and, to promote fairness and decision making. And then agency, especially now, like how do we support meaningful change? How do we focus on the what, as Constance and Daniel mentioned? Like, how do we focus on the why of assessment, not just the what of assessment? Why are we doing this? If we know this information, we've collected 3 years in a row, why are we doing this again? Like, what do we hope to uncover? Do we really have an understanding about the why, and making sure we honor that? Constance, Daniel, did I miss anything here that you'd like to add? Okay. Back to you, Dan.
Sorry about that. Had to find the audio button. No, that was a great encapsulation of that work. Here are the principles once again, the Accelerate framework. And I'm going to drop the link again inside of the chat if you joined us a little late to kind of download your copy of the principles. I'm going to very quickly kind of just give you some quick one-liners of each of these. So the QR code will also take you to the document, but the Accelerate principles are designed for active use. And in that revision process, I remember like one of the first things we did with the original set of principles was just like let's get to the core of what this is saying, right? Like what's the action that is trying to be that might be kind of buried a little bit inside of the paragraph that was there. So assessment being aligned purposefully. So this is speaking really to broader alignment through things like strategic plans and curriculum and policy and mission and vision and some of that work that, my office is an assessment office, but we also do evaluation and strategic planning and all of these other kinds of continuous improvement processes. It's continuously cultivating, and very specifically using that word cultivating instead of continuous improvement. It speaks to the idea of assessment as working to improve curricular and kind of programmatic areas, but but sometimes not everything is like I'm constantly having to improve and improve and improve. Sometimes it's just kind of making sure that the field is still operating where it is so that that learning can grow inside of it, right? It's collaborative and co-creative. So with all of our partners, and what's of particular importance here is including learners in all of the stages of assessment and their contribution in all of the work of assessment, just not the folks that are giving us the data. Equity and empowerment motivated. Assessment as a tool for enabling access and enabling opportunities across whatever kind of context that we're operating in. It is learning centered, with a focus on learning and learning wherever it may be happening within whatever institutional context you're in, but also like learning about itself, right? The act of assessment is an act of reflection, and that you're learning about the assessment as you're doing the assessment. So really adding that like growth mindset to all of the work of assessment. Energized by expertise. And I think the key word in that one is energized. That assessment professionals and practitioners develop their skills, and the more skills that you have across your organization, it can really accelerate and supercharge the impact that your assessment is having, right? So, and a lot of us have gone through in our organizations, like we're trying to develop as many people with as many skills as possible, so that we can really get the data that will allow us to take action. So it's really energized by the expertise. Responsiveness oriented, so it is both proactive and reactive to the needs of the learners and the kind of shifting contexts that we're existing in. It's action driven. So it is intentionally structured to do something with the data, right? That we're keeping the end in mind, that we need to actually do something with the information that we're collecting. It is transparent and trustworthy, and this really speaks to the work that we do in kind of human-centered consultative kind of roles of assessment, that we're building trust, communication being really, really key to the act of assessment, relationship building, all of that kind of leading to success. And then enduring and evolving, that we are iterating and kind of expanding maturity, scalability, sustainability, all of these things of like we're building practices that kind of build upon each other and become more sustainable and evolve over time, and being able to kind of replicate that work over time. Oh. So as Divya had mentioned, this is the kind of thinking through this across all the domains and levels that kind of exist within our institutional context. So not only within the academic work of kind of courses and programs, but also kind of the co-curricular space, student affairs, administrative and institutional assessment, accreditation, and Constance had mentioned kind of that original set really being kind of driven by a lot of that accountability and kind of that accreditation mindset and focus, but also external review and peer review and workforce and skill development, that all of the different kinds of domains in which learning is happening can benefit from the framework. I want to we're going to go through some examples of like some use cases that we're thinking about right now. But I want you to be thinking, kind of reflecting, if you would use the previous principles, are there ways that this update is changing the way that you're thinking about possibly using them in the future? Is this your first time kind of being exposed to the principles? Like how would you see yourself using them in your context? And we'll talk about that afterward. But off the bat, in terms of kind of a good student affairs use case, as I had mentioned before, I encountered the first set of principles in like this assessment education context, right? I was asked to teach the grad class on assessment. They told me I had to use this book. The assessment principles were inside of that book, right? And I was like, ah, there they are. I've been doing this, and like here they are, kind of in front of me. I think the framework can help kind of level set what assessment is across kind of the unit that you might be operating in. So I can see myself using this with the directors and the folks that are kind of gathering data inside of my area and going, okay, this is why, this is how we're trying to use our assessment. This is why we're doing assessment in the way that we are. But also thinking about in that educational context for new practitioners or professional development programs, redesigning kind of the curriculum of how we're teaching assessment, not to be like do you know how to run a focus group? Do you know how to do a survey? Do you know how to use data in a certain way? And what if the curriculum itself is aligned around each one of these points inside of Accelerate, and then the tools and the learning of the tools and the doing of assessment is directly in relation to the individual aspects of the Accelerate framework. Also thinking about it as a tool for assessment advocacy with leadership. How do we drive organizational action with the data, right? So when I'm speaking to leadership inside of my division, right, like the framework of why we're doing this is all about action. So are we taking that action? Are we being transparent with how we're taking that action? And also, could we use this as a tool for additional resources, right? Doing a self-assessment of my office and going, okay, where are the gaps, right? I can see we have a communication gap, so maybe I need additional resources to help me communicate my findings and communicate how that change is happening. The only way that we can drive action from the work that we're doing is if we can turn the data around pretty quickly, right? So do I need people on my team that can help me kind of accelerate how that data is kind of being presented and given to folks?
So I will share some additional examples within my context as well. So one of the easiest things that you can see on the screen is in our office over the summer we came up with we crafted our office vision, mission, values, and I would encourage all of you to craft those for your offices in terms of what stands out for you and what you're aligned with, because then again, especially in today's context, right, I wish institutions would also do it, because then you can say I am living my mission, I am living my values, like our office values, right? And then what does accreditation ask for? Are you mission aligned in the work that you're doing? Are you delivering on your mission? Are you delivering on your vision? Are you living your values? So you can go back to these principles. And so in building on what Dan said, we are going to be using these principles to assess, like every project that comes into our office, we're constantly checking, are we involving student voices? Are we involving the folks who are going to be impacted? Sometimes we have leadership saying, but why do you need to do that? Or why do we need to do, we were drafting some questions for a survey, and we said the way to draft these questions, so it's not just about the rules of survey design, it's about how do you engage in that survey design process. So we said we need to have the actual respondents' voices, like look at these questions and tell us like what questions we should be asking. We don't even know what we should or shouldn't be asking. And so they were like, but why do we have to do this? And it's like, no, this is best practice principles. So you can use these principles to say this is best practice, this is what the field has said. So we want, so that's one way. And then I just want to address really quickly, there was a question in the chat about energized by expertise. I think assessment, again, because it originated as by faculty for faculty in its inception during the accreditation movement, the assumption is that you can get voluntold to do assessment and you're going to do it. Right? And most of the times faculty and staff are oftentimes floundering saying, but I don't have the skill set, but then I can't let people know that I don't have the skill set and I can't do this, or how do I do this alone? And it's often people without power to necessarily unvolunteer themselves to say, I'm not going to do this, right? And so the idea is that this is just like, you can't just automatically be a good leader, or you can't just automatically be a good educator. We all assume that, everyone's going to teach really well. No, you need some training. So the idea of the principles is to say, yes, we do need some training, and it's okay to say I need some training. And so then where do you start with some training? Where do you start with the guidelines, and what are these principles? So we want to establish assessment as a field of practice that does require some expertise, and it's not just data analysis, it's not just data visualization, it's not just continuous improvement or change making. There are all of these things to assessment that we feel like we, all of us at least, the authors, we all feel we're constantly still learning, so we're not experts, but we want to move in the direction of saying not everybody can just do it off the bat. It's something that you have to hone your skills, build credibility. There are so many aspects to it. And so, yeah, so I wanted to address that, and that we want these guidelines to serve as a tool where you can go back to it as a resource, but also assess, like, get at what's working, what's not working in all fields, for program assessment, for institutional, like your core assessment, gen ed assessment, however it works. So over to you, Constance.
Thank you, Divya. I will speak to when we talked about the principles at Assessment Institute. Expertise came up, and often it's assumed that it's a degree acquisition, or that there's some sort of learned course that we're going to, suggest that one goes through. And I would say we're thinking very expansively about the definition of expertise as both a lived expertise, meaning that just having learned from your own promising failures might have taught you a lot about doing assessment, as well as the learned, which is that you may have a degree that really enhanced and helped you to do this work. But there is value in many types of expertise, to Divya's point. I'd like to use another example at an institutional level, and I have many examples here, so I'll just highlight two. One related to our very first A, the aligned purposefully. When we go before our board every year, we do an assessment update at OHSU. And the intent of that is to really highlight the alignment of what's happening in the classroom, outside of the classroom with our student affairs units, all the way up through the curriculum that they created, through our administrative leaders, and all the way to the board, so that there is a public message that says what the value of what we are doing on the ground is, and how it's aligned to the larger institutional mission and vision. And so I would say that that aligning purposefully has been really meaningful to our work. I think the exploring expertise is actually highlighted in the strategic onboarding. Often when we ask people about those principles, they say they use them as an onboarding tool if they use them. And so we have started thinking about and reimagining what it would look like for us to take things like our assessment academies and rethink them into something else. And there are places where we're doing training for our leadership. And is there a way that we could include these revised and kind of thought of principles in some of our leadership training? They don't need to know that they're receiving assessment training when we're doing this leadership training. It's just that we're intentionally integrating these principles everywhere we have an opportunity, so that it guides the work, and that it's not new language for them to hear, that it should be aligned, and that it's continuously cultivating, that we're really using data in intentional ways, that we're co-creating. That language should be foreign to them. And so how can we integrate that with our leadership training as well? Next slide.
Excellent. So before we kind of share with you some of the initial feedback that we've received, some other kinds of ideas around some bigger kind of contextual issues that kind of surround the principles, we want to hear from you. So just having heard the principles, which principle maybe feels the most immediate or compelling to you? Can you think of any use cases that you might have for Accelerate? I'm going to put the link inside of the chat in addition to those questions. We made a little feedback form if you are so inclined to share. And while we're waiting for folks to kind of drop things inside of the chat, Constance and Divya, I'll maybe put you on the spot a little bit. Is in drafting these, was there any kind of principle that kind of jumped out at you as the one that was the most kind of urgent, or spoke to you maybe?
For me, I would say there were two. One was, or three. Oh my God. Okay, all of them. But okay, so, but I think the three. I think action obsessed or action driven was the one that because I feel like a lot of times in assessment work, especially in the work in my world, we're measuring things with no change. Like we have no power over decision making. And so we say, but our job, we have to do this job really well. And so there's so much of load on our partners, on students. We collect all of this feedback, and there's no assurance on any kind of it influencing any change in the near future or in the far future. And so that, like, including that has then now helped how we approach it, at least how I approach assessment, because I'm like, here are the recommendations, and then I follow up. So what have you done with that data again? Like, so it's I see that as part of my job. It's not like me stepping out of my lane. Part of my job is giving you the data, giving you the findings, making recommendations as part of the findings, and then also saying, so what did you do? Like, what has changed? Kind of. So I'll stop with that one.
I'll jump in and say that the enduring and evolving, which is the last E of accelerate, is both an interesting one for me, kind of conceptually, but also practically, which is it's a lot of work to get assessment plans off the ground at an institutional level, at a programmatic level. And the first time you do it, you put a lot of energy to kind of get the system in place. And it's possible that you could continue to work at that pace, but most of us have to back off after kind of the liftoff energy of getting our assessment processes in place. And we need to sustain that work. And the question of how to sustain and maintain quality without kind of over investing in some cases in activity, busy work, that we're doing it in a meaningful way is a really delicate balance. And I continue to want to see us demonstrate what we do well, but I want it to be sustained well, and not just for 1 year, but ongoing activity that we can demonstrate value in for years to come. And so I love the idea of sustainability, the enduring practice.
I know the idea of continuously cultivating is the one that really jumps out at me, mainly because I remember I'm on an institutional assessment committee, and I'm like kind of the odd man out. It's all the decanal units and then the student affairs assessment guy, right? And they all got in a very heated debate about continuous improvement. Like, well, what if I'm doing this really, really well and I have the data that shows, like, how am I supposed to be improving on something that can't be improved upon, right? And the kind of dance that my academic kind of counterpart had to go through of like, well, when we say continuous improvement, it doesn't mean constantly improving. It means this other more kind of subtle, nuanced thing, and the idea of like, well, if it doesn't necessarily mean that, then why are we saying that, right? So can we speak about this in a way that kind of clarifies that idea that like like striving for improvement constantly isn't necessarily the end goal. All right. And feel free to I don't know if we want to do. I can go through some of the feedback that we initially received really quickly, and then we could just kind of open it up for Q&A. If that sounds good.
Dan, did you want to go over the initial feedback, tensions, and challenges after you give the feedback? Yeah.
Sure. So the initial feedback that we received, as we're talking about this, and Constance referenced this earlier, this is very much like a living document, right? That we're not quite at the like this is, there might be some subtle tweaks. So here's some of the feedback that we've received during all of these phases of outreach, right? This idea between like best practice versus good practice versus promising practice, and the fact that we're calling this best practice. The previous edition was good practice. Are well, like what is like maybe some of the messages that are being sent right through the variations inside of those different words. The fact that there's some, like, not all of the buzzwords in our field are inside of here. Some of them are in there like once or twice, but the word data, the word information is in there a lot more than the word data, because I feel like the word data kind of gives a certain perception of what you're actually doing. And when we're talking about action, right, information and action are really tied to each other. But curiosity, change, continuous improvement, like, where are all these buzzwords? I'm used to seeing frameworks and documents that have these things. We have a definition of assessment that, to Divya's point about like the breadth of the amount of people that this is supposed to kind of encapsulate. Our definition of assessment, is it too broad? Is it too narrow? Does it speak to all those different kind of experiences around assessment that we see? The idea of expertise kind of jumped out as, is expertise being explained as like a more of a growth mindset thing, or are we saying like you have to have like a assessment professional on your campus? And I think Constance spoke really, really well of the idea of like, no, sometimes your expertise is really your lived experience that you've gone through. Other kind of tensions and challenges that we see kind of surrounding the document are things like resistance to change and inertia of established processes that exist at your university. Those kind of bigger things that didn't necessarily need like a specific call out as a standard inside of the principles, but are surrounding and influencing the principles, time, resources, buy-in from all the folks that are involved in this in terms of faculty or staff. I know a lot of staff, trying to convince staff that like assessment isn't like an extra piece of your job, but is actually a thing that is part of your job. Compliance versus internal improvement, and that was, the founding principles 33 years ago were struggling with that tension. And then the more kind of structural alignment that we have across silos. All of those things are kind of things that are ideas that are kind of surrounding the principles and influencing how we can kind of implement them inside of our context. Before I share my screen and we have a little conversation, we just did want to mention really quickly that we do have a call for abstracts. The three of us will be working, co-editing a special edition of Intersection. And we currently have a call out for abstracts, just kind of asking about how you might see yourself kind of using, or how you see these principles reflected in the work that you're doing. I encourage everyone to kind of check that out. And I dropped that link inside of the chat.
Yeah, and it's a pretty aggressive timeline. I think we have 10 days just to get any abstracts in, so keep it coming.
Yes.
We also have a book proposal in the works, and again, as someone who is a very diffident writer myself, please do not let worries about you have a story to tell, you have an experience to share, you have something that you're doing that speaks to the principles that you see. Draft it up, write it. We want to support your scholarship journey in whatever way possible. And if it's not in the special issue, we may use it as case studies in the book. So we're still visioning that as we speak. But don't let the naysayer in your head stop you from 500 words. Like, we can all, we'd love to work with you.
Certainly. So I'm going to stop my screen share and open it up to questions.
Dan, did you want to share like some feedback that folks? I thought you were going to do that, or no, initial feedback.
Oh, that we are.
Oh, that was what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we are currently receiving inside of that.
Yeah,
form?
I thought you wanted to share that, right? Or did you?
I can. Let me pull it up real quick.
Or okay. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Oh yeah,
My
no
bad.
problem.
While Dan is doing that, there was one question in the chat about AI. And again, because this work was done over the last year, The AI was present, is prevalent, and I think we chose not to include it specifically in the principles because, again, AI is kind of like survey design. It's a tool. It's we see AI, without getting into the ethics of like environment and the global north versus the global south and extraction and like all those ethical elements of AI, and the functionality of AI and the use and the benefits of AI. AI is a tool, and folks can use any tool that would help them move in the direction of the values and the principles articulated. So that's the connection, but it doesn't stand out to us as something. For us, the principles are a lot more everlasting. It's a living document, and the idea of best practice is to be able to justify adopting these principles and these values and saying this is what we are striving towards, and this is what we want to achieve, and how we do that is with AI. So and that's each individual's decision. I don't know, Constance, Dan, did you all have any other thoughts to add about the AI question?
Yeah, I think Divya, you said it well that often these principles were created for professionals to think about how they will engage and the values that inform their behavior, and not so much the tools that they use to do that. And so this is really kind of a values-based commitment to the work of assessment more than a tool-based judgment. So yeah, well said. Oh, Tori, it looks like you've included a question. Thank you to anonymous participant and around the question of how this applies in states with legislation restricting the use of DEI and how they might engage with the principles. And Divya, I have some thoughts, but I don't know if you want to, because we've talked about this. So what I would say is that there are always going to be restrictions on the way that people can apply all of these principles because of the nuanced kind of legislation and policies and procedures at our own particular institutions. But we do believe that the principles stand on their own, and the definitions and the way in which they're applied can be modified. So again, if we're talking about the aligned purposefully, we could look through an equity lens to think about that work, but we can also apply it far beyond the equity lens. And so we think that there's, while there's a thread of equity language in many of the content of the work, it is not limited to. And so the broadest application could be used, or it could be narrowly scoped. If there was one that probably is the most limited as far as language goes, it would be equity and empowerment motivated, which is it's one of the E's, not the last, but and I would say if it was just a word change for someone to use, do it, right? Like the definition doesn't actually change. So we are not tied so specifically to language. It's the meaning behind that language of the principles that we're trying to achieve. But Divya, please feel free to add more to that.
I think the only thing that I would add is, again, a very privileged position to be in California in a private Jesuit institution. So again, like a big hug to the anonymous person virtually for what you're dealing with. But the idea is don't get caught up in the language. Don't get caught up in the words, in the sense of like, that's why we have a statement, we have a question, an evaluative question, and we have the why. So if you want to choose, if you want to use in your training and you keep the principles and you want to, go off of the principles for a training, use empowerment and say, how are we, or if you can't use equity, then say success for all students, right? Like, how are we ensuring success for all students? How are we investigating that? And again, like, I cannot emphasize enough how subversive we can be as assessment professionals if we come into our power to just do the work, like walk the walk. We don't have to talk about it, but walk the walk of looking at what is the data showing us. Are all the students successful in this particular course? Like, I'm seeing, let me just look at all the DFWs and see which students are experiencing the highest DFWs. okay, we want all students to be successful. So even if you use all students successful, or we want to foster belonging and students don't have access to this, we have the most power and the most access to information and the greatest strength to be able to connect the silos, connect student affairs to academic affairs. And we need to step into it. Just let's do the work. And then hopefully this too shall pass and we can then talk about it. But yeah, and feel free to reach out to me offline. We can strategize subversive things.
And when you think about the word empowerment, right? Like if you look at the text inside of there, it is like, empowering people to do something with the data, right? Like that we're empowering them to make a change of some sort. And if you need to strip away language, also speaking from a very privileged space in New York, so. Oh, somebody has it. Do we have a graphic of the Accelerate principles? Working on it. Definitely working on it.
Yeah, we want it to be very nature oriented. There's something about like the ebbs and flows. And we have, like, I think Constance's office was able to generate a wonderful like flower petals, like with 10 petals. And so we're trying to figure out where we land. But ideas are always welcome. That too can be incorporated in that form. We will read it.
And a lot of people talking about how their use of the principles really being in like how they're training other people to do assessment, how they're creating checklists for themselves to kind of do some self-evaluation, how they're onboarding people, reviewing mission statements,
Nice.
looking at other departments' reports and kind of applying the principles to those reports. Yeah, great.
Yeah, if you all have connections with professional accreditation bodies, if you all have connections with your regional accreditation bodies, please feel free, like on our behalf, to float these principles and to push that out in peer evaluator training or peer reviewer training, right? Feel free to connect them with us. We're always happy to socialize this. Yeah. And then if anyone has any questions about the the call for abstracts, happy to take them. I think we have 3 minutes left.
Tori, I see you have it in there. So a plug for the next structured conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So first, a big round of applause to our presenters today for the fantastic presentation. As I mentioned in the chat, I was not familiar with the Accelerate principles prior to receiving the revision, but I'm actually really glad that I have them now. I think that there's lots of really useful information here. So truthfully, thank you all. I also did link the December structured conversation in the chat. Let me pull up the date here. So it is going to be December 3rd from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time, and that's 11 a.m. Pacific time, 12 p.m. Mountain time, and 1 p.m. Central time. So hopefully you're able to join us for that. We will distribute a recording after the session, but thank you again to our presenters. They shared their contact information. Please do feel free to ask them conversations. So I will go ahead and stop the recording, but thank you all so much for joining us. I'll hang out for a few minutes along with our presenters if anybody has any follow-up questions, but thanks again, everybody, for joining.